Hey guys, we got some new merch in the merch store that's all linked down below, or you might see some of the shop pop up down below the video. Be sure to go check it out if you want to get some new merch. We got some new designs, they're pretty sweet. The last day of school before Christmas was always something I looked forward to as a kid. I loved Christmas in general, and it goes without saying that I look forward to the day itself a lot more, but I enjoyed the school Christmas party nonetheless. There would be a Christmas disco and a buffet, party hats and Christmas crackers, even a few games like Pass the Parcel and musical chairs, all soundtracked by classic Christmas pop songs by the likes of Slade and Wham. And things got slightly different as we got older and progressed into secondary school. There were no more Christmas parties in the afternoons, and the buffet with party bags was relegated to a few pigs and blankets on your plate come lunchtime. But there was still a very festive atmosphere around the school. Some teachers wore Christmas jumpers and were much more laid back than usual. Others phoned it in completely and just let us watch an hour's worth of A Muppet's Christmas Carol, or in the case of our history teacher in 2003, the entire first hour of Saving Private Ryan. But then, in that same year of 2003, the last day of school before the Christmas holidays turned out to be anything but festive and joyful. I remember it being a Friday in December of 2003, and this might sound like a bit of a time warp to some of you, but I distinctly remember my mates and I being really excited to play Call of Duty. See, the original game, back when it was a World War II shooter, came out in the autumn of 2003, and that was the same year our history teacher showed us a bit of Saving Private Ryan, even though we were in year 8 and the film was 15, which was very cool of him. So, as you can imagine, my mates and I were mega hyped about playing a cutting-edge FPS set during that period of history, and it was all we'd been talking about for weeks. After lunch, spirits were still high as we sat in geography class as the teacher had yet again opted to just put a film on and wasn't fussed about us talking amongst ourselves. My friend Nick and I were gabbing away about Call of Duty, and our desk was on the right-hand side of the classroom next to some windows which overlooked the school's main courtyard from the second floor. That meant that, as I was talking to Nick, I could see over his shoulder and into the empty courtyard. I'm mostly paying attention to him, and the courtyard is deserted because classes were in session, so there was nothing to distract me while we were talking. But then suddenly, a man I didn't recognize walked into the empty courtyard wearing a dark jumper, jeans, and what looked like work boots. I say I didn't recognize him, but the school had all kinds of ground staff and visitors coming through every day, so it wasn't like the sudden appearance of someone new was going to alarm me, and I carried on talking to Nick after diverting my gaze for only a moment. But then, instead of just walking across the courtyard to wherever he was going, the man stopped and began looking around like he was lost. Again, that behavior wasn't anything I found particularly alarming. People unfamiliar with new places often do stuff like that, don't they? But then instead of taking a look around and then heading off in whatever direction he was headed, the guy just kind of stopped, looked up toward the sky, and then started just sort of staring at it. My attention was diverted from Nick for a second time, but unlike the first time, I gave the guy such a confused look that Nick turned to see what I was looking at. We both looked at the guy for a few moments like, what the bloody hell is he doing? And Nick then made a joke about a seagull doing a well-aimed poo, and we sang I'm Dreaming of a Shite Christmas until our teacher told us to stop swearing. I honestly thought the fella would have moved on by the time we'd been told to shut up, but when I looked out the window, he was still there, staring at the cloudy gray sky like he was hypnotized by it, or could see something no one else could. The spot where the guy was standing was surrounded by buildings like the teacher's lounge, the modern languages block, and the geography block, which was where me and Nick were. Then as we're looking at him, wondering what the guy's problem was, a French teacher named Miss Hamilton walked out of the teacher's lounge and did a proper double take at the guy still staring at the sky. Nick and I were in stitches at this again because Hamilton was a dour woman, if ever there was one, and seeing that dourness directed at someone other than us was somehow very satisfying. Most likely under the assumption that this guy was supposed to be there, Miss Hamilton tried walking straight past him, and at first, the bloke didn't seem to notice that she was there. But then suddenly, he spun his head around to look at her, and everything changed in an instant. His eyes lit up, and as he aggressively turned towards Miss Hamilton, she stopped dead in her tracks, and the man then raised something above his head, and although I couldn't see exactly what it was, Miss Hamilton certainly could. The sight of it caused her to back up a few steps before she turned around and legged it back towards the teacher's lounge as fast as her legs could carry her. And the strange man followed, not quite as fast as her, but still just meters behind, and in a split second, Nick and I went from laughing and joking to, oh no, this is serious. Nick didn't watch the whole thing unfold. He turned back towards our geography teacher and was shouting, Sir, someone's chasing Miss Hamilton." But I saw the whole thing. Hamilton only made it back into the teacher's lounge by maybe half a yard before the man chasing her started bashing at the door with something I didn't realize was some kind of hammer or mallet. But by then, our geography teacher had seen what was happening, and after telling us all to stay put and not look out the windows, he ran out of our classroom and ran downstairs to lock the door to the whole geography block. He told us this once he returned, so we all felt a lot safer, but there was obviously still the matter of the guy walking around trying to attack people with his hammer, and so our teacher pulled out his mobile and called the police. He'd already told us to stay away from the windows, but no one listened to him, and I remember at one point the guy looked up at our classroom windows right at us, and the look in his eyes was so freaky that one of the girls actually squealed in fright before she backed away from the window. I don't blame her for screaming either, because not only was there a look in this guy's eyes like he completely lost his mind, but he looked deformed. He had swellings around his eyes and cheekbones, things I now realize were the results of someone hitting him in the face somewhere else while trying to defend themselves. But at the same time, his face was so effed up and his hair was all wild and bedhead-like too that it looked like our school had been invaded by some kind of hammer-wielding hills-have-eyes mutant. Our geography teacher, a guy called Mr. Griffiths, told us all again to get back away from the window, and then when we ignored him, he literally roared at everyone to get out of the classroom and wait in the corridors. I say this in half jest, but I honestly don't know which freaked us out more at the time, some random bloke with a hammer having a violent mental breakdown, or seeing a meek, gentle-hearted geography teacher like Mr. Griffiths suddenly scream at us like that. It was so scary because it showed how frightened he was, and a display of fear and authority like that ramped up the anxiety levels by a good couple of notches. We did as he told us, went out into the corridor, and waited there while trying not to freak out too much. We could hear Mr. Griffiths talking to the police, asking them to be as quick as they could because the man would most likely attack the next person he saw. Apparently, our teachers were all calling each other on their mobiles and telling each other to keep everyone inside. So at least for a couple of minutes, we all had the impression that although the situation was severe, our teachers had it under control. But that only meant that when chaos returned, the fear was so palpable you could practically taste it. Like I said, we were standing in the corridor of the geography block, which was only quite small, with 2 classrooms on the ground floor and the 2 on the first. There was also an open L-shaped stairway heading down, so we were able to hear anything that happened down there. So, when we heard the sound of hammering, then a smash of glass, it took us seconds to realize what was going on. The guy with the hammer couldn't smash his way through the block's main door, but he could smash his way through one of the windows, climb through the empty frame, and then make his way to us through the classroom's unlocked door. And to say that caused panic would be a major understatement. We screamed back into the classroom telling Mr. Griffiths what we'd heard downstairs, and he immediately burst into action. He told the 999 operators that the situation was becoming increasingly urgent, and then directed some of the boys in our class to clear the room before shoving his much larger and heavier desk in front of the door to act as a barricade. Another lad had the idea to shove the wooden doorstop underneath the door to provide some extra security, but other kids still piled desks and chairs onto Mr. Griffith's own in a mad panic, while others cowered in the corner or looked for windows to open as routes of escape. It was probably the single most terrifying experience of my life, just waiting for some hammer-wielding maniac to make his way up the stairs into our classroom. Little did I know, it was about to get so much worse. As we heard someone reach the top of the stairs outside the door, everyone went quiet. Seconds later, we saw the man's face as he peered through the little perspex window in the door, and one of the girls began to scream again. His eyes were just horrifying. His gaze looked hollow, like all sense of reason had completely evaporated. He didn't speak, he didn't smile. He looked at us all for a few minutes and then started trying to open the door. This prompted more screams from my classmates, and remember, we're all only 12 and 13 years old, so we were really scared and completely out of our wits and in no frame of mind to put up a fight. The man tried with all of his might to open the door to that classroom, but thankfully, he failed. The barricade was just too strong, and no matter how much he shoved or kicked, the door simply would not budge an inch. In his frustration, he started smashing the door with his hammer or mallet or whatever it was, and while this caused more screams from the girls, I remember feeling this muted sense of relief. No matter what was about to happen, there was no way it was happening in our classroom, and although it was scary, we were safe. The guy hammered on the door a few more minutes, and he managed to bash out the glass before attempting to reach for the doorknob. Obviously, that was no use to him, and after a bit more hammering, I remember Mr. Griffiths looking out the window and shouting, "The police are here, children. Everything's going to be fine. This man's not going to be with us very much longer." And he was right. Mr. Griffiths had seen 4 or 5 police officers running across the courtyard, and after they entered the geography block via the same route as the hammerman, they baited him downstairs and used a stun gun to subdue and arrest him. We had to stay locked down in that classroom for another hour, and then the head teacher announced that the hammerman was safely off school grounds and we were free to come out. What followed was total chaos, because it was announced that any kid whose parents could collect them from school reception were free to leave as and when their parents arrived. This meant that almost every kid in the school was ringing their mom or dad, begging for lifts from those whose parents weren't too busy to come and collect them. It was easily the most unschool-like atmosphere I had ever experienced while in education, and I just never have imagined that not being a good thing, if that makes sense. Something really and truly terrible had happened, and the fact that no one on school grounds was seriously hurt is nothing shy of a miracle in my book. It turns out the bloke with the hammer had bashed one other person before heading towards our school to look for soft targets. Apparently it was a complete mental breakdown. He had been a regular tradesman with a wife and a baby on the way, and then one day he just snapped and went on a hammer-bashing spree that ended in a school just a few days before Christmas. It's scary to think someone can just go crazy like that, and even scarier to think that they'll target children when in that state of mind. He was close, too, very close, and God knows what would have happened if he'd been able to force his way into our classroom that day. But that's exactly why I consider his failure to be my very own Christmas miracle. In the summer before my senior year of high school, I got involved with a guy from school named Sean. Our friend groups had kind of merged that summer, and 2 of our mutual friends were dating, but what we had was very much a situationship. And at first, he seemed to understand that. Now, I know that might sound cruel, to basically tell him, "I like you, just not enough to be my boyfriend." But we had senior year coming up, the single most important year of high school, so I didn't want any distractions once school started up again. And like I said, he seemed to totally respect that at first. But when it came to going back to school, it was clear that he had no intentions of letting things go. At first, we kept things professional, and neither of us entertained the idea of hooking up again. I could tell that he wanted to, and I'd be lying if I said his feelings were not reciprocated, but that was just the problem. Sean seemed like the perfect distraction, and at the time when I needed one like a hole in my head. But then, when it came to the holidays, he made me a very attractive offer. He claimed that he was handling his emotions, respected my desire to focus on school, but thought that we might be able to hook up again over winter break. And having him be that into me was very flattering, I won't kid you. And so I figured if he could continue to remain professional once school started up again, hey, why not? All of my other friends were either finding festive flings or hooking up with their boyfriends, so a little company over the holidays was very welcome. But as it turns out, I made a huge error of judgment in thinking Sean could remain mature about it. We ended up going on a few dates around Christmas and New Year's, and they were great, but not long before we were due to head back to school, he asked if we could have a little talk. I knew what it was going to be about, and so the prospect filled me with this kind of dread, but I figured then would be as good a time as any to set him straight regarding our relationship or lack thereof. But Sean was persistent. He agreed that school should take priority for me, but suggested that we could undertake study sessions together so we could see each other while school was still in session. Now, don't get me wrong, that sounded like a wonderful date idea, but it would be just that, a date. And since being together would not be conducive with concentration, it was a no from me on that one. Sean suggested that if I ended up getting into NYU, he could move to NYC so we could pursue a relationship there. I know it wasn't the craziest idea in the world, but the idea of him packing up his whole life for my sake was just way too much pressure. It just wasn't an idea I wanted to entertain. We were too young to let our stupid crush dictate the course of our lives, but Sean didn't feel that way at all, and unfortunately, we went on to have a huge falling out over it. The discussion kept going around in circles, it seemed, and the more it did, the more it frustrated me. I kept telling him, I need to leave before I say something I regret, and he didn't let me leave, so I ended up saying something that I went on to regret. I said something, and he said something. Things got pretty heated, and then we both very angrily agreed to call it quits. It wasn't the way I wanted to end things with him, but he made any kind of amicable split completely impossible. He'd gone from down for something casual to thinking that we were soulmates in 6 months, and so on the advice of a friend, I decided to go no contact. But then, since we both went to the same high school, it was much easier said than done. We didn't have any classes together, which I thank God for at the time, but it was inevitable that we'd bump into each other in the corridors. And when we did, it was awkward as hell. He tried to get my attention a few times, but I knew that it wouldn't do him any good. I'd said my piece, and I had nothing left to add, and the sooner that he got over me and moved on, the better, I thought. Acknowledging him wouldn't have done either of us any favors, so I kept my eyes forward, kept walking, and prayed that he'd finally see some sense and stop trying to talk to me. But he didn't. Instead, Sean decided to start coming over to my family's home to try and speak with me face to face. And that only happened but one time, because when I realized it was Sean at the door, I told him he had exactly 1 minute to make himself disappear before my dad got to know what had been going on. He said that he wasn't leaving until we agreed to sit down and talk, so I stayed true to my word and told my dad that a guy from school was harassing me. He marched out toward the front door, and I couldn't watch at first, so I just stayed in the TV room and sat down on the couch with my head in my hands like, this cannot be happening right now. I have no idea what was said at first, and I'm not sure I want to, but the moment my mother and I heard my dad yelling, "Are you crazy? Get the hell off my property," we knew things were about to go south, quickly. The next thing, we heard my dad get real angry, and then the sounds of a struggle, so my mom and I ran outside to see my dad basically dragging Sean back up our driveway with a hand around his throat. He wasn't choking him, and Sean was trying to struggle against him, but my dad was way bigger and had no problem manhandling Sean off the property. It was honestly mortifying in the extreme, but a part of me was kind of glad things had come to a head, because at least after that, it would be over, right? Well, Sean let me know that that wasn't going to happen by saying that he was going to do something to me at school before spring break. My dad said something about him not coming to the house anymore or he'd really give Sean an ass whooping, but then he responded by saying something like, "Oh yeah? Well, you can't protect her at school, can you?" It was enough to make my mom gasp, because in a way, Sean was exactly right. He just didn't count on my dad getting him suspended for that week of school before spring break. My dad called up our high school, had a long talk with our principal, and the end result was that Sean would be suspended for those final few days of school. You figured that that might give me some peace of mind, and for a while, I guess it did. I felt way more at ease at school. I wasn't looking over my shoulder every 5 minutes, but I still wasn't completely relaxed. And that's because I knew that there was nothing anyone could do to stop Sean showing up on the last day of school. Outside school, I mean, because he basically knew exactly where I'd be and when. And this weighed on my mind the whole week. And then on Friday, the last day of school before spring break, I approached a guy named Ryan and asked if he could do me a huge favor. I knew Ryan from math, and we talked a little here and there, but we didn't consider each other friends by any stretch. He asked me what was up, and after gathering my thoughts, I asked if he could give me a ride home from school. Now at the time, a girl asking a guy for a ride home had become sort of a byword for "I like you," and since I was anxious over the Sean situation, I was very quick to let Ryan know that my request was only that, a request for a ride home and nothing more. I know for a fact that I was giving off major panicky vibes because he had this big frown on his face before he asked me what was going on, and he was just being polite. He knew what had happened with Sean and my dad, and really everyone knew, and I guess he just wanted to hear it for himself. But if he didn't, well, I sure told him. After that, he said he was game to drive me just about anywhere and said to meet him at the back of his locker come the end of school so he could walk me to my car. And I felt this wave of utter relief wash over me, and then after thanking him from the very bottom of my heart, I went about my day feeling like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I usually walked home, a route that Sean was very familiar with, so if he wanted to confront me, I had no doubt that's where he'd do it. School seemed like there'd be too many people around for such a potentially embarrassing confrontation, so getting a ride home seemed like it eliminated that possibility entirely. But let me assure you, seemed as doing an assload of heavy lifting in that sentence. A few hours later, come the end of school, I met Ryan at his locker and we made our way towards the student parking lot. As we walked, I thanked him profusely for a second time and then said how, if he knew the kind of favor he was doing me, he'd be charging me airline prices to ride in that passenger seat. Again, I think Ryan knew exactly what kind of favor he was doing for me because news about the fight between Sean and my dad swept through school like the September sniffles. But he chose not to make a big deal out of it, which I thought was really sweet of him. I remember this feeling of almost weightlessness, the impression that everything was going to be fine because there really were good people still out there. And then a split second later, I heard the rev of an engine and the screech of tires. I turned back to see a silver sedan roaring through the parking lot in our direction. It was coming at us almost impossibly fast, and there was a split second where I really did think, holy crap, this is it. I'm gonna die. But then the next moment, I was hurtling to the left and hitting the asphalt so hard that I felt a surge of pain shoot through my shoulder. I fell between two cars, both of which protected me from the silver sedan as it smashed into them. Ryan, on the other hand, was not so lucky. Upon seeing the silver sedan speeding towards us, Ryan's first thought was to shove me out of the way. But in doing so, he made sure that it was far too late to get his own self out of its path. I didn't actually see it happen, but I later heard the car hit him so hard that he went flying through the air before landing in this just heap. But at that moment, all I was interested in was getting as far away from it as possible, either because it was about to take another charge at me, or the driver was about to get out of it and finish the job by hand. As I tried to stand, the driver slammed the car into reverse. I couldn't put any weight on my left arm at all, so it took me longer than it normally would have to find my feet, and this gave the driver time to reverse, get a decent run-up, and then drive at me once more in the hopes of inflicting some kind of extreme physical trauma. I'd just made it to my feet before I slammed into the rear of the car to my left, but by that time, I was mobile enough to jump back away from that danger zone. I remember how after the smash, I looked into the driver's side of the car to see who it was, but in my heart, I already knew. I knew who was driving that car from the second I saw it speeding at us. It was Sean, and he'd come to kill me. I just ran, faster than I'd ever had before in my life, and luckily, because of how the parking lot was set up, Sean had to navigate around the blocks of parked cars while I was quite easily able to get the hell out of there by running through the smaller gaps. After that, I'm pretty sure that he took off with the police looking for him, whereas I ended up at the school nurse before being taken to the hospital. And the doctors at the hospital had a bunch of questions for me, and so did the cops, but all I wanted to know was one thing, and that's how Ryan was doing. It took a while to get a solid answer on that, but when I did, I wept with relief. He was alive, barely, but he'd managed to hang on. And it was me that had been the target of Sean's attack, and I'd walked away with nothing but a broken arm. Ryan, on the other hand, had a fractured skull, broken ribs, a pelvic fracture, and even a bunch of herniated discs in his spine, which I've heard can be incredibly painful. That was the hit that I should have taken, and that's not to say that I would have been as fortunate as Ryan in surviving such unfortunate injuries. I owed him my life, and now I'm set to spend the rest of it with him in holy matrimony. We ended up meeting for drinks a few years after we both graduated because I wanted to catch up and buy some cocktails for the man that saved my life. That became a regular thing, and now I'm all set to become Mrs. Ryan in the summer. Checking on Ryan turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd ever made, but as far as Sean's doing, I couldn't give a rat's ass, and I hope his time in prison was hell on earth. He got 15 years for attempted murder, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was released before then, but honestly, I don't know if that was the case or not. I haven't checked because I don't care, and I don't worry about ever bumping into Sean either, because if he ever chooses to show up at my family's house, it'll be the last thing he ever does. I went to high school with a boy named Ashley. Ash had blonde, curly hair, a little bit of an overbite, and was ever so slightly overweight. He could look quite slow sometimes, staring glassy-eyed and slack-jawed at the blackboard each morning during reception period, but in reality, Ash was pretty sharp. His grades were good, he went to chess club in years 7 and 8, and then he was actually on the debate team for a while before things went pear-shaped for him at school. Because unfortunately, as well as being one of the cleverest lads in our year group, Ash was also a complete weirdo. To give you an idea of just how weird Ash was, I was once told that he had a deathly phobia of vinegar. 3 lads in my year group told me in the dinner hall at lunchtime one day, but since they were laughing when they told me, I didn't believe them and very foolishly decided to test out their claim. A few minutes later, Ash walked over with his dinner tray and then sat a few chairs down from me. Then, after getting his attention, I flicked a bottle of vinegar in his direction, causing a few drops of it to land on the jacket of his school uniform. At first, he seemed just a bit confused and looked at me like, "Have you gone mental?" And I was half expecting to see the lads that had told me that he was scared of vinegar to be pissing themselves laughing like, "You gullible twat." But when I looked over, they were horrified. Not a split second later, the whole dining room hears this ear-splitting screech. Ash jumps up so hard his chair falls over, and then he goes running out the dining hall with literal tears in his eyes. He'd realized it was vinegar that I'd flicked on him, and his reaction was to completely freak out. Ash was a bit weird, but also a bit of a prankster. And so when he jumped up and ran out screaming like he did, most kids assumed that it was just some kind of joke. However, when we later found out his reaction was genuine, Ash solidified his reputation as being, to put it nicely, an absolute Fruit Loop. I actually got into a bit of trouble over the vinegar flicking incident, but nothing too serious, and Ash accepted my apology, so there were no hard feelings. He continued to put in a good performance at school, and he got to be quite outgoing for a while, and would sometimes come and play football with us on the school's AstroTurf. But then, the school held a business studies fair, and although that might sound like the most innocuous thing imaginable, it put us all on the road to disaster. So right as we were about to pick our exam subjects, our school started teaching business studies as a GCSE. They tried it one year, but hardly anyone signed up, so the next year they put on a little fair in an attempt to drum up interest. Now, I won't bore you with all the little details, but the main event was a talk from some prominent local businessman, and he spoke at length about the need for free thinking and innovation, as well as the raw desire to go out and make our fortune in the world. I think it just went in one ear and out the other for a lot of us, but in Ashley's case, he took it to heart. He started buying blank CDs, burning people's album requests onto it, and then reselling them for like £1 profit per unit. It started with just a few, enough to buy himself some sweets from the school tuck shop, but then after a while, even some of the teachers were buying bootleg CDs from him, and he'd sell maybe 10 to 15 a day. Well, as some of you are probably screaming at the screen right now, this was extremely illegal, and it wasn't long before Ash was called into the head teacher's office for a bollocking. What he was doing was obviously wrong, but from what I heard, the way the school handled it was ridiculously harsh. I think the school feared some kind of lawsuit and wanted to make an extreme example of Ash to stop other kids from starting up illegal side businesses. Because when it came to his punishment, it seemed way out of proportion. Instead of giving him a slap on the wrist and telling him not to do it again, Ash was suspended for 2 weeks, given 4 Saturday detentions in a row, and had to write a 1,000-word essay on why what he was doing was wrong. This was an insanely harsh punishment as it stood, but what totally wrecked Ash's head was the fact that less than a week before, he'd been encouraged to be innovative, free-thinking, and entrepreneurial. Granted, the guest speaker at the business studies fair didn't mean start pirating music and selling bootleg CDs to everyone, but Ash was almost 15, and everyone does daft, harmless things at that age, really. He should have gotten a slap on the wrist, maybe 1 round of regular detention at best, but for some reason, they came down on him like a ton of bricks. The whole experience must have had a profound effect on him because, after that, he was never the same. His grades dropped dramatically, and he became increasingly antisocial, and he became the focal point of a number of minor scandals. He got caught smoking behind the school gym one lunchtime, and then another time, teachers found a can of lager in his bag, and he'd also loudly argue with teachers pretty regularly until I think even his parents got involved and began imposing punishments at home. And during his last year of secondary school, which is 10th grade in the United States, Ash's behavior started to level off. His exams were coming up, so I think that's what had him knuckling down a bit in terms of his academic performance. But at the same time, he was still this seething ball of resentment who despised almost everyone and everything. Cut to early April, about 6 weeks before exams, and we got a special announcement in assembly come Monday morning. Someone had been stealing crates from the school dinner hall, and it was costing the school money, because the catering companies expected the crates back, and the company was charging the school a premium for each one that was missing. The head teacher announced that although they didn't yet know who was doing it, they'd inevitably find the culprit and they'd be severely punished. But I remember everyone being incredibly confused. Of all the things to steal, why steal wooden fruit and vegetable crates? And in any case, who was the crate thief? And this went on for weeks, and there wasn't much the school could do about it. They bought a special wheelie bin to put all the empty crates in, but whoever was stealing them started coming to school with an Allen key where they just unlock the wheelie bin and steal more crates. Everyone knew it was happening, but it was probably the most boring mystery in the history of time, so nobody really gave a toss apart from the school. But then one morning, I solved at least half of the missing crate mystery all on my own. Our school had a breakfast club, and in the run-up to the exams, I had decided that I'd start going to get some extra revision in with a bacon buddy and a cup of tea, and Ash was almost always there first. In fact, the one time I arrived bang on 7 o'clock, he was sitting on one of the benches outside the dining hall, looking like he'd beaten me to it by at least 5 to 10 minutes. Because no one really gave a toss about the crates going missing, I didn't devote too much thought to it either. But later that morning, when Ash reached into his blazer pocket to fish for change, I saw what looked an awful lot like an Allen key in his fist before he quickly dropped it back into the pocket. On the way out of breakfast club, I caught up with Ash and quietly asked him why he had an Allen key in his pocket. He tried to deny it at first, but when I asked if it was him stealing all the crates from the school bins, his smile told me all I needed to know. I swore I wouldn't tell anyone it was him, but then I had to ask, why steal crates meant for the dinner hall's catering company, and why steal so many that it required a special mention during that weekly assembly? Ash just gave me a sly wink and told me, "You'll see," and then walked away. I remember telling only one of my mates about it, only after swearing him to secrecy on his mom's life. And then when I told him Ash was stealing the crates, he says, "Is that it? I thought you were about to tell me something like life or death." He was perplexed as to why the whole thing even interested me in the first place, but when I explained how Ash wasn't just stealing crates, he was planning to do something with them, my friends started to understand my fascination. We thought that there was a good chance it was some kind of money-making scheme, but then having him say, "You'll see," didn't make much sense if that was the case. If he was just selling the crates, what was there to see? We didn't find out what he meant until the last day of school, but if I'd even gotten so much of an inkling as to what he was planning, I'd have gone to every length to stop it. So the last day of school was Friday, the 25th of May, and as you can imagine, we expected a great deal of hijinks. There'd be pranks, water balloons, everyone would be signing each other's shirts and whatnot. But what we didn't expect was to turn up to school and see a huge wooden behemoth standing proudly on the sports field. The sports field was way out behind the back of the school, whereas the dinner hall was near the front, and so when I arrived at school, I didn't see what many others did that morning until much later in the day. The first thing I personally noticed was that Ash wasn't at the breakfast club, but that didn't mean anything to me at the time. It was only later on that I heard rumors of a big pile of wooden planks on the sports field, but it wasn't until lunchtime that me and my mates were able to walk down to the field to see what was going on. It wasn't just a big pile of wood. It was a big pile of wooden crates. And when I say big, I mean really big. It was at least 2 or 3 times as tall as me, maybe 13 to 14 feet high, and it was even wider at the base. It looked like a giant rough pyramid, then as people got closer, they started to smell the fumes. It was a bonfire, a massive bonfire made entirely of wooden fruit and veg crates, and by the smell, someone had poured a lot of petrol all over it, or at least some kind of flammable liquid to aid in its ignition. There was just a handful of curious kids standing around by the time we got there, but in the minutes that followed, the situation escalated dramatically. Within just 10 to 15 minutes, the crowd surrounding the bonfire swelled from about a dozen to between 200 and 250 kids. News of the bonfire had spread like wildfire, excuse the pun, and I think our school's teachers were too busy trying to put out other, more metaphorical fires because, as I said earlier, prank season was in full effect. Everyone was so excited for some riotous act of rebellion on the last day of school, and when Ash delivered, they flocked to the sports field at the first available opportunity. By about 12:40, Half the school had encircled the bonfire in the expectation that someone was going to light it. And before long, someone did. I don't know who had the lighter on them, but someone did. And then seconds later, a kid in year 10 was approaching the bonfire with it, along with a rolled-up bit of paper to act as kindling. He approached the pile of acrid-smelling crates to the cries of, "Do it! Set it on fire!" And then after a bit of theatrical nervousness, the kid lit the paper, leaned down, and then started trying to set the pile ablaze. There were a few moments of doubt, and then a cheer as we all saw a rush of flame in the core of the pile. Then the next thing, there was a flash, and a bang. And then the crowd surged backwards. I remember how at first the sound of the explosion caused most of the girls present to start screaming hysterically. I mean, obviously the boys were screaming too, but it's the ear-splitting sound of the girls that really stuck with me at the time. There were crates flying through the air, pieces of shattered wood flying even higher, and some of these pieces were actually on fire too, so they'd leave these trails of smoke in the air as they flew and fell. It was pure chaos, and naturally kids were scared, so they were screaming. But then I also remember the distinct movement when the screams of terror were replaced by the screams of pain. I had been a few rows back as people gathered round the bonfire, so I quite literally had a meat shield of other kids in front of me when the explosion happened. So when it did happen, it sent all kinds of sharp wooden splinters into the kids in the front row, as well as a bunch of the kids in the second row too. The result was almost 20 to 30 students, all lying among the grass surrounding what by then was a blazing inferno, and almost all of them had suffered horrific injuries. Everyone had white shirts on because, since it was summer, almost everyone had left their blazers in their lockers. So imagine all that blood against all that shredded white linen, and how much more pronounced it was compared to if we'd been wearing our own clothes. Kids had suffered cuts from flying debris, burns from errant embers, and the shock of the blast itself. One girl's hair was almost completely singed away, and she was shrieking in pain from the burns to her ears and scalp. What had once been a joyous atmosphere had been transformed in a split second into one of blood, smoke, and terror. It was like something from a nightmare, but it was real. And for some of us, the reality of it kicked on sooner rather than later. Sometimes when I ponder on the nature of humanity, I remember how some kids reacted after the explosion. A lot of kids ran all the way back to the main school, some because they were scared and others because they wanted to inform teachers who would in turn summon emergency services. I think both options have their merits, and I don't blame anyone who ran because they were scared, because I was there, and it was one of the most horrifically frightening scenes I've ever witnessed. But not everyone ran. I remember standing there probably gawping at the aftermath in complete horror when one kid, David Oakes, ran past me and towards the fire. He stopped, turned back, and shouted, "Give me an effing hand, will you?" and then carried on towards the fire to help drag victims of the explosion away from it. And I snapped out of my daze and followed David, and then helped him drag or carry those who couldn't walk away from the fire. Their shirts and pants had been ripped, and there was blood all over the grass, and one kid, named Stuart, had a huge splinter sticking out of his leg. He wailed in agony whenever we tried to move him, but we didn't have a choice. It was that or burn to death if the fire started spreading across the grass. Not long after, the first teachers arrived with first aid kits in hand, and a teacher started directing us on how to best care for the injured before the ambulances arrived. It was an incredible display of bravery and mental fortitude, one I'll remember for as long as I live, but the atmosphere very quickly turned from compassion towards those affected to anger towards those responsible. Ash had decided to stay in bed for that last day of school. After hearing about the bonfire explosion, his parents came home early from work and were about to rush to school to see if he was okay when they suddenly realized that he was in bed. At first, upon seeing that he was fine, they must have been relieved. I can only imagine their reaction when they realized Ash staying in bed all day meant that he'd most likely stayed up all night, and that the bonfire had no doubt been built and then soaked in petrol during that same period. As you can imagine, the parents of wounded children wanted heads to roll, so it was only a matter of days before Ash was questioned and then arrested by police on suspicion of arson and GBH. We were convinced that he was going to get sent to prison or something, but not only did he never admit to building the bonfire, but the police didn't have a scrap of evidence that he was the one responsible. Everything hinged on Ash admitting it. Then when he didn't, the police had no choice but to let him go. They did everything they could to try and get CCTV footage of him doing just about anything, stealing crates, building the bonfire. I heard they even canvassed petrol stations in the hopes of catching him buying petrol. I imagine they tried a ton of other stuff too, but none of it worked, and although most are 90% sure that it was him that built that bonfire, 99.9% in my case, Ash was never punished for it. There was only the lingering suspicion that he was responsible, but even then, he can't share all the blame. Ash didn't set that bonfire aflame. He didn't even have to hand anyone a lighter either. He simply planned it, built it, and then trusted that a bunch of naive, excitable children wouldn't be able to help themselves once they saw it. And he was right. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, hugs are free in Siberia.